Order, order. Mr. Clive Betts to move the motion.
Always a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move this House considered the fourth report in this session of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee into the private rented sector. Mr. Rossendale, we chose to have this inquiry as a select committee because of the increasing importance of the private rented sector. It's doubled in size over a 15-year period. Clearly, there are more families living in the sector now than ever before, and more people who are seeing the sector as their long-term form of accommodation, whether by choice or because that's the only form of accommodation available to them. We did hear that 82% were satisfied with their accommodation, though sometimes I question whether expectations are as high as they might be when people answer those questions. Because if you look at the other figures, while non-decent accommodation in the sector has fallen from 47% to 27% over a 10-year period, the actual number of properties which are non-decent has stayed the same because it's a low percentage of a larger number. Also, Citizens Advice produced figures that 41% of tenants in the sector had what they thought had waited longer than was reasonable for repairs to be carried out, and 800,000 properties had a Category 1 hazard. Now, there are clearly problems, but while many properties may have some problems, there clearly are some other properties which are in a really bad state of repair, and some landlords which do little about that and indeed almost run a business in having properties of that type. Of course, I give way.
On that point, and I thank my honourable friend for having secured this debate, and he's making an excellent speech and for allowing me to intervene. Does my honourable friend not agree that we need to give local authorities the power to tackle and crack down on rogue landlords through private sector licensing, rather than having to get permission first from central government?
Well, we made a number of recommendations in the report, Mr. Rossendale, and my friend's absolutely right. That was one of the recommendations that I think we recognised that the government had made some changes to the rules on selective licensing, in line with the committee's recommendation from our previous report back in 2013-14, when we talked about widening the criteria which could be used to bring about selective licensing schemes. They're also changing the legislation now about the definition of properties which are included in HMO licensing as well, which we welcomed. But nevertheless, our recommendation was essentially this ought to be a local matter, dependent on local circumstances. It should be a local decision, subject to the Secretary of State's intervention only when local authorities hadn't followed the proper procedures. And I think that was something the government are clearly now, as I understand it, doing a review of selective licensing. One of the questions I'll be asking Mr. Rossendale is the state of that review and when it is likely to report. I think that's a number of questions I will have along those grounds. But I think we did try to focus in our report on those landlords who are not doing the job we'd expect them to do. I suppose you try and divide them up. There are bad landlords who are just not very good at getting around to doing things in a timely way. They're inefficient and incompetent to some extent, sometimes the accidental landlords. There are other landlords described as rogue landlords who have more systematic failings and leave a large number of properties in an unacceptable condition. But then there is the really hardcore, I think, we ought to call them criminals because that's what they are. They're criminal landlords who run a business about exploiting vulnerable tenants, leaving them in unsafe and unhealthy conditions. And basically, they're not merely robbing the tenants, they're actually robbing the taxpayers as well of the money they're getting in for not providing homes that are fit to live in. So that's where we try to concentrate on how we deal with those. And we do recognise, and have recognised in the report, actions the government have already taken in a number of respects. Indeed, I think we've highlighted quite recently actions the government have taken in response to our previous report on the private rented sector, and that's something that we can be pleased with as a committee as well. I think we refer right at the beginning to this imbalance of power between tenants and landlords and how it needs addressing. We mentioned the Deregulation Act 2015. What I'm trying to do, Mr Rossendale, is not go through all our recommendations, but trying to focus on where the government said they're going to do something, either to consult or to review or to consider in some way, and to say to the Minister, where has that got to? What can we expect? So, Deregulation Act, we call for a review of the retaliatory eviction legislation and guidance and how it worked. The government didn't seem totally enthusiastic about it at first, but now they have said they're going to do a review of the Deregulation Act 2015. I think they're going to look at the effectiveness of retaliatory eviction and also the issue of potentially bringing in more formal requirements to have longer-term tenancies. It's been a bit quiet on that since the government announced it. So where is that up to? Where is the review of the Deregulation Act 2015? When can we expect some announcements? We called for a specialist housing court to try and make it easier to get... Yes, of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this debate, and I want to put on my record my apologies that I'm unable to stay for the duration of the debate because I'm hosting elsewhere in this place an event on a related matter, which is housing rent arrears arising from universal credit. So my apologies for that. In relation to the question of retaliatory evictions, the committee recommended reform of Section 21. There is a growing body of evidence that actually Section 21 needs to be not only reformed but abolished. The government said in their response to our report, on the one hand, that they recognised concern about retaliatory evictions, but on the other hand, that they did not accept our recommendation that Section 21 needed to be reformed, saying instead, we believe the current legislation strikes the right balance between the interests of landlords and tenants, and we have no plans to change the legislation. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that without meaningful action in relation to Section 21, these are simply empty words on the part of the government?
Well, I think it would be helpful if the Minister comes back on that, because we made a clear recommendation there, and it would be helpful to have the Minister's response to that, because I think the two things do go together. We didn't call in our report for the abolition of Section 21, but merely that it should be looked at again. And the same is true of retaliatory evictions. So if the government are looking at one thing, could they indicate they might be prepared to have a look at the other as well as part of a joint review? In terms of the Specialist Housing Court, pleased the government have now announced that they are going to have issued a call for evidence about the setting up of a Specialist Housing Court. Could the Minister explain what that will cover, the likely terms of a housing court's jurisdiction? Will it cover Section 21 notices, retaliatory eviction? Will it cover the issue of tenancy fees, which we've had recent legislation on? Will it cover issues arising from my friend's bill, the Homes Fit for Habitation bill? All the issues arising from that. Will it go so far as to look at the whole issue of leasehold that we are discussing in another inquiry, Mr Rossendale? Or could the Minister explain precisely what it will cover, or have the government ruled out some things that it won't cover? I think it would be helpful to have information about that as well. Two issues we asked to be looked at were the issue of 5-year electrical safety checks. We're pleased the government has announced in principle support for that. When are we going to get a clear announcement and action on it? On carbon monoxide alarms, to be in every room where there is not merely a coal fire but a gas fire as well. I understand there is a working group inside the department looking at that. Could the Minister say where has that got to? Because every day's delay could lead someone to lose their life because of carbon monoxide poisoning, when it's very simple to stop it with a very simple measure indeed. So could the Minister give us some information about that? We looked at the issues of enforcement and local authority powers. That's clearly very important. We questioned the housing health and safety rating system. We have done that in... Yes, of course I will. Yes.
I'm very grateful for giving way. On this point of enforcement, the committee makes the point in its report that half of the prosecutions in the country happen in my borough in Newham. And I wonder what, in the committee's view, are the problems with the enforcement arrangements that seemingly make it so difficult for the vast majority of local authorities to carry out prosecutions in this area?
Mr. Russell, I think it's a very good point that my right honourable friend raises. And Newham clearly is a trailblazer. I think it's 50% of the prosecutions in the country happen in Newham. I think that there are two probably main issues that we looked at in the report. One is resources. Now, I'm sure it's not true that Newham have got too much money and don't know how to spend it on other things. I'm sure they have many challenges. But the other one is political will. Now, is there a political will in the council to actually address these issues? Clearly, there was in Newham, I think there still is. Some councils are beginning to wonder when there's no prosecution at all, that applies to more than half the councils in the country. Now, I know council will say, we adopt a softly approach and try and persuade. Now, often that goes on with landlords who are more in the reasonable category, they're more in the inefficient and incompetent, and officers go along to them and say, look, you need to put this right, you need to sort it, and they do, but not with the rogues and the criminals. You need tougher action, so I think that's right. And I think it is a political will at the end of the day, though clearly resources are an issue when they're under pressure, and with pressure on care services, and we're going to look at children's services shortly in the committee. That doesn't mean there's less money for other important things like private sector housing enforcement. But also we looked at the powers and how simple and easy they were to use. The rating system is complicated. I think the committee said that. Is there a case for bringing in a simpler minimum standards? Now, the professional officers don't want to change, I think, by and large. The problem is, and I think landlords as well as tenants gave us evidence, that while the rating system may be understood by most professionals working in the service, it's understood by very few landlords and virtually no tenants. And it is a system which is that complicated that nobody outside the professional sphere understands it, really fit for purpose. Now, the government has been doing some events, I think, where they've been talking to professional officers. There is a division of opinion amongst them. Perhaps the majority still want to keep the rating system. But at least I think the government now has acknowledged there is general universal support for updating it, both on the evidence base and the guidance, because they're very much out of date. And I think, again, if the Minister could tell us how far we've got with that, that would be very helpful as well. But I think one of the landlords' organisations gave evidence to us and said that the whole issue of private sector housing legislation was based on 150 different pieces of legislation around the place. And everything the government does, however worthwhile, is built on top of this higgledy-piggledy structure without any real coherence. So we've said, would the government go and ask the Law Commission to do an overall review of this? We made it in our recommendation in 2013-14 report as well. I do think at some point someone's got to do a comprehensive review, not necessarily of changing the intention of the legislation, but pulling it together in a coherent whole. I think the government's response has now been that they're going to have discussions with the Law Commission about this. Again, could the Minister say where those discussions have got to? That would be very helpful as well. Also, we raised the issue of the level of fees and penalty notices. I think the government have said they think they're at an appropriate level. The committee wanted to see them raised because sometimes the fees that are levied, the fines that are levied, are a bit of extra for some of the really bad landlords. They're a business cost, and they write it off against the business. That's what they are. So increasing them, but also making sure that the courts give the cost to local authorities who take a case. Local authorities under pressure of resources, if they spend a lot of money prosecuting a landlord, they get the prosecution, and then the court doesn't give them all the costs involved. That can really be discouraging. So I just wonder whether the Minister had any discussions with her colleagues in the Ministry of Justice about taking that recommendation forward as well. One thing we did recommend as well was that there is a benchmark system created whereby the different approach of different local authorities could be compared with each other, including the number of prosecutions they take out, and asked the government to work with the LGA on this. The government said they're going to have talks with the LGA. How far have those talks got to? That would be very interesting to hear. In terms of banning orders, and the committee supported the government's decision to bring in banning orders, there has been publicity, I think, with the Guardian ITV news issue about the fact that these banning orders aren't public. It's not to say that they won't happen, but they will only be, I think, in terms of the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, available to other local authorities to use in terms of their business about tackling problems in the private rented sector. They can't be made public as the legislation stands, as I'm told. Now, I think the government, and the Prime Minister has committed to changing that, but I understand it also needs primary legislation. Could the Minister say whether the government does intend to bring primary legislation in to do that? Because one of the problems is that while a local authority may know someone is banned in another local authority area, knowing precisely whether a landlord's operating in your area, what properties a landlord has, is very difficult because there's just a lack of information around, and having that information public, a landlord's been banned, would cause other people to come forward and say, well, that landlord's banned and he's renting a property to me or renting a property down our road. What's going to be done about it? That would be really, really helpful if it could be done. Indeed, I went to a meeting of the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health Officers in Leeds the other day to talk to them about our report and general support for it. But very interestingly, Mark Baxter, who was an environmental officer in Scarborough Borough Council, said if the government's going to change the legislation, could they go further and insist that when a landlord is banned at the court, they have to give to the courts for public record a list of all the properties which they own, manage or have an interest in. Now, that seemed to be an incredibly simple but very effective way forward. Now, if there is a view that publicity shines a spotlight on these bad landlords, then make them help in the process by giving that information. And, of course, it would be an offence not to give all the information at that stage. And that would be very helpful to get a proper grip on this issue as well. Yes.
On that point, and I thank my honourable friend for giving way once more. He is being very, very generous with his time. Would he not agree with me also that there needs to be a deposit cap at 3 weeks' rent rather than the current 6 weeks as proposed by the government? Because that would mean an average saving of £575 for tenants across England based on the latest English housing survey data.
Well, I think that came up in the tenancy fees legislation, and I think we actually recommended a compromise as a committee of 5 weeks. I think that's where we got to. So I can't completely agree as chair of the committee today, because I think 5 weeks was our compromise, which the government didn't accept at the end of the day, but we still want to support it, I think. But I think what the government has done now, if I remember correctly, is to actually have a consultation about alternatives to deposits. And that, I think, is a helpful response to one of our recommendations as well, which is welcome. So I just say to the Minister, clearly, I think we're all in agreement. We've got to get as tough as we can and tougher still on these bad landlords. I just hope the Minister at some point will revisit our recommendation that these really bad landlords, these criminals, banning them and having management orders against them, in the end, some of them will find ways round it because it's really profitable for them to do so. They've broken the law once, so if they can break the law in ignoring banning orders, then they will carry on doing that if they can. So in the end, why don't we act to take the properties off them? Why has the government resisted that recommendation? The proceeds of crime operate in other spheres. So let's get really tough on these really bad landlords. My peroration was just about finished, but I'll let it be interrupted.
I thank my honourable friend very much indeed for giving way again. Just to add a very small example to the point that he is making so powerfully. My constituents were evicted from their private rented property after they had complained because the ceiling in the bathroom had collapsed over the bath 10 minutes after they'd finished bathing their children. I hope the Minister would agree that in circumstances such as that, it is not too much of a sanction to confiscate the property from such criminals.
Well, I would hope the Minister would accept it today. Just reflect. Even if she can't commit herself to a change of policy today, to have a think about it. These people are bad people, renting bad houses to vulnerable tenants. So they're making lots of money out of it. They're making proceeds out of their crime. So let's take off them the asset which enables them to do that. I hope the Minister will think again about that and hopefully respond to the other points that I've asked her about during the course of this contribution.
The question is that this House has considered the fourth report of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee, Private Rented Sector HC 440 and the Government Response HC 9639. Mark Prisk.
Mr Rossendale, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to follow the chairman of our committee, the member for Sheffield South East. And on the last point, certainly when I was looking at this as a housing minister for those crooks running beds in sheds and often human trafficking alongside, I entirely agree. Seize the asset, take the money off them, make them pay for what they're doing. But let me come to the broader issue as well. But he's made a really good set of recommendations about the committee's report. And I think 6 months on, from when we published and from the government's response, it is a good time now to step back, look where the government's got to, and also look at the market as a whole. And as the Select Committee Chairman pointed out now, it is 1 in 5 households who live in rented accommodation. There are many reasons for that. Some of them are economic, some of them are demographic, some of them are social. And whilst clearly many people would prefer to own their home, we also shouldn't ignore the fact that there's an increasing number of young people, certainly that I talk to, who prefer to rent. This is the generation expecting to have 2 or 3 careers, never mind jobs. The generation that rents its music, doesn't buy, perhaps as old fogies, I nearly said a wrong word there, Mr. Rossendale, as old fogies like me might have done. So their expectations are different. And when we form policy, we need to think about that generation as well. Now, during the inquiry, as the Chairman said, it was the case that the majority, the vast majority of tenants said they were satisfied. And I think it's a fact that we shouldn't overlook. But it is also the case that the gap between the majority of homes and the very worst has actually increased. And that is why I have no hesitation in supporting the bill to which the Chairman referred on standards and conditions, the Honourable Member, I think, for Westminster North, or North Westminster, perhaps I should say, because it will help us to root out the worst offenders. But put simply, reform is needed of the sector, but it should be focused. And we shouldn't be tempted into pretending that every landlord is out to exploit their tenant. That helps no one. What is needed is a rental market that is consumer-led, tenant-led, if you like. That means clarity around services provided and charges made. It means having fair dispute and redress arrangements for when things do go wrong. For me, it also means greater choice and a more modern housing stock. So that's about encouraging more homes to be built for rent, but also substandard homes to be rectified. And it also means, and it comes to a point raised earlier by the Honourable Member for Newham East, that local authority enforcement needs overhauling to be both consistent and effective. And I'll come on to that particular point in a moment. Now, one of the key themes that came out of the report focused on the respective rights of landlords and tenants. And for me, one of the main benefits of the Tenant Fees Bill is actually that it will help to clarify the role of landlords and letting agents, of client and agent. And alongside reforms to money laundering, for example, I think this will help the market and the way it works for people. But our report also sought a clarification of the law around people's rights and obligations, including tenants. Now, I welcomed in the government's response the notion of having and now publishing easy-to-understand how-to guides for tenants. That's good. But what is also needed is indeed potentially a consolidation. It is for the law itself to be made simpler, not just the words that describe it. Equally, we should all, as legislators, recognise that sometimes laws and regulations are limited in what they can achieve. They will certainly stop bad practice, but they're not good at changing the culture of a business sector, of promoting best practice. For that, we need people in the sector themselves to change. We need the practitioners to raise their game. And that means qualified letting and managing agents, people who are personally committed to high standards. So what needs to happen? Well, first, I think that we should make it a requirement for anyone working in lettings and property management to be qualified. Members of the public might be amazed that that is not the case now. Secondly, the scope of the qualifications shouldn't be imposed by government, but should be agreed jointly with the industry, but also with consumer representative bodies. I think of the Consumer Association and Which as a good example. And together with professional bodies like the Institute for Residential Property Management, and also, and I am a member, a fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, together those qualifications need to be forged. We also need to make sure that we grandfather, we transfer across the existing qualifications and make sure they're part of the new process. We can't afford to create a new barrier for those people who have already committed to being professional. Indeed, there's a shortage in terms of residential property management. So some of the blocks where our constituents live, there's a shortage of good qualified people. We don't want to create a problem there. So grandfathering across existing qualifications would be sensible. And thirdly, qualifications need to recognise not only different roles and levels, but also the different demands of, say, the private rented sector and the social housing sector as well. Essentially what matters is that the people doing their job are competent to do the specific role they undertake financially, technically, and of course, legally. And I'd also want to see a culture of continuous professional development incorporated in this sector so that people keep up to date. I think these elements together, which build on the comments within the report, would help to change not only who works in the sector, but the standards they maintain. And I'd be very grateful if the Minister could specifically address those points in her reply. We've heard already about the standard of the buildings themselves and the housing stock, and I think this is going to be a very big challenge. And it's right that we rectify and improve the bad buildings we have now, but we need to do more than that. We need to build more modern homes to rent. And that was why in 2012-13, when I was the then Housing Minister, I actively promoted a new model, the build-to-rent market. Attracting billions from the pension funds and long-term institutions, this market has now blossomed in the last 5 years. Over 117,000 homes are now under construction or available to let, homes that are modern, homes that are purpose-built, homes that are available for long-term leases, and that provide services to tenants. And I think that this market, as it matures, will be able to offer an even broader range of both homes and rents and provide greater choice for tenants seeking an alternative to the old housing stock. So again, in her reply, I hope the Minister will confirm that the government is committed to continuing to support the build-to-rent sector in the years to come. The committee report also highlighted the need for effective enforcement by local authorities, and this was touched on earlier. I think some of the most concerning evidence we received was not only the low level of enforcement, the huge variability between councils in very similar areas. The Residential Landlords Association, for example, told us that in 2016-17, in that year, whilst there are over 105,000 complaints made by tenants, councils prosecuted 467. That is less than 1/10 of 1%. Now, I appreciate, as members said, that the prosecution of someone is not the sole action in enforcement, but it's a pretty good indicator. And at less than 1/10 of 1%, something isn't working. It's hugely variable as well. As we heard, in London, there are 32 London boroughs. One of them, Newham, is responsible for 60% of the actual prosecutions. And we heard as well in 2016 in the committee that apparently 6 out of 10 councils had not prosecuted a single landlord in 2016, in that year. As David Cox from Arla told us, and I'm quoting here, and it's in the report, the laws are passed, they're just not enforced. Now, I think part of the problem is a lack of money, and that's why we asked the government to ensure that councils have the money both to enforce current but also future regulations. But it's not just about money, and this was highlighted by the Honourable Member of Sheffield South East a moment ago. I think what came very clear there is what are the local political priorities? Where is the political leadership in each local area? And that's why I strongly supported the notion from the committee of having a benchmarking exercise, a scheme, introduced, funded and run by the government and managed through the Local Government Association. Councils would publish the data of the number of complaints they received and how they are resolved and the prosecutions so that we can, all of us, our constituents included, compare enforcement levels between the councils in similar areas. In her reply, could the Minister just update us on what progress has been made with the LGA on that particular issue? Yes, I will.
Thank you for giving way. In boroughs such as my constituency is in 2 boroughs and they have very different approaches. In one of the boroughs, in 2016-17, they had to spend £5 million on temporary accommodation. For them, it's sort of counterintuitive to try and end any sort of tenancy, no matter how bad the landlord, because then they have to house somebody and they don't have any housing stock. So it's political will, it's resources, and it's also doing something about the private rented sector, but also finding premises for people to live in that are safe. So it's supply as well. It's a very complicated situation. Would he agree?
I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I think it is complex, and that's why I think just benchmarking this solely on prosecutions is too narrow. But she's right to say that there is a constant challenge for councils to judge the resources available. I just think the levels of enforcement and the fact that neighbouring councils in similar areas suggests to me that the system isn't working. The last point, Mr. Rossendale, I want to flag up is about something which I think both the committee may want to come back to and indeed the government. And that is whether this report and indeed the government's response isn't in danger of being overtaken by technology. For example, online services like Airbnb are creating completely new ways for people to find somewhere to stay, ostensibly and originally, of course, in travelling on holiday or whatever. Equally, the web is now enabling the emergence of a grey market in informal serviced lettings. And I've seen examples in my constituency of both of these. Now, no one is quite clear how to define this activity at the moment, let alone whether it can be regulated. I mean, at what point, for example, does an Airbnb letting, initially for 1 week, may become 2 weeks, could become 4 weeks? At what point does that letting become something more formal? And should those platforms which enable the transaction be defined as letting agency in law? Now, some would reasonably say, and it would be my natural instinct to say, don't interfere, don't meddle. But as we tighten up the regulation of the private sector, the private rented sector, the danger is that the crooks will shift into these emerging markets, creating the potential for the next property scandal. So I think all of us in this place, but obviously the Minister in particular, will need to decide how to ensure that any changes we make are future-proofed. Does the technological nature of the transaction matter, or do we just focus on making sure that the consumer rights are modern and up-to-date? And how do we shape the regulations so we don't stifle genuine enterprise? I hope that the Minister can tell us what the government is doing to think about that, or at least that she, and I'm sure she will because she's always looking at the picture in the round, as any good minister does, whether in fact the government would be prepared to look at this and whether in fact it's something we as a committee should consider in the future. So, Mr. Rossendale, I think there are a number of crucial areas where the reform of the sector could not only make a positive difference for tenants, but for landlords as well. I think the report sets out a very clear way forward, and I look forward to the Minister's response in due course.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Rossendale, and a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I, first of all, refer the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Interest in that I'm a Vice President of the LGA and also owner of a small property portfolio. I rise really to do three things. First is to talk about the situation in my own borough of Harrow. Secondly, to look at the detailed report that we produced as a committee. And thirdly, just a few things that I think need to be added. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Hertford and Stortford with a measured approach and his experience of being the Housing Minister. And equally, to follow the Chair of the Select Committee, Honourable Member for Sheffield South East, who I've worked with over many years, probably more years than we care to mention, really, on this committee. And it is fair to say that one of the things that we have done on this committee, certainly over the period that I've served on the committee, is to make sure we proceed by consensus, and therefore there may be views of individuals that are not contained within this report, but it is the report of the entirety of the committee on a cross-party basis. So I warmly welcome the Minister to her place and welcome her back in her job. And I hope that she will be able to answer some of the issues about why the government are not taking forward measures, some of the measures that we've recommended, as I say, on an all-party basis. So turning to the issue in terms of my own borough, the situation is that the private rented sector is growing quite dramatically. It used to be a tradition in outer London in particular that as people became more prosperous, as they became more likely to commute longer distances, they would sell their homes and move on
and then commute into central London for a job. Nowadays, what tends to happen is they don't sell their homes. They do move on and they acquire a new home, but they keep their existing home and they rent it out. One of the challenges that has therefore come is that in a large number, in Harrow, large numbers of properties, which are typical suburban 3-bedroom semis, are now rented out to 10, 12, in some cases 20 people who are living in these properties. This brings all the consequences of antisocial behaviour, overcrowding, and quite frankly, those people who are living there are being exploited. Most of those people who are in this position come from Eastern Europe. I now have 10,000 Eastern Europeans living in my constituency alone, and the reality is those people are warmly welcomed. They're here to do work. They want to work. They want to contribute to the economy, but they are being exploited in the way that they are in a position whereby rents, typically of 3-bedroom properties now, are of the order of £2,000 a month. But of course, if you have 20 people sharing that £2,000 a month, it's not too bad as a rent. However, the living conditions are absolutely disgraceful. So that's one of the, I think, key challenges. The local authority have responded to this by setting up a selective licensing scheme in one of the wards, which was vigorously opposed by the private landlords concerned, for the obvious reasons that they thought they were not going to be able to continue to exploit their tenants in the way that they were. So I think this is one of the challenges, I think, for the government, in that when legislative changes are taking place, we don't want to get, as the honourable member for Hertford and Stortford raised, the vast majority of tenants are, of course, satisfied with their position. However, we have the challenge of what do we do about those people, those bad landlords, criminal landlords, who exploit vulnerable people and make their lives, quite frankly, a misery. But I will give way to the Chair of the Select Committee.
I think it is over 8 years since we've been on the committee together. But in terms of selective licensing, I think we've all had examples of landlords behaving quite badly, not merely in letting properties, but objecting to licensing schemes. It isn't simply about the regulatory framework. I think it's also about the fact that their names will actually be known, which properties they own and rent will be known, and HMRC gets rather interested at that point, and the cost of that could actually dwarf anything else they have to do in terms of paying fees for the licence.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that intervention. It's quite clear. One of the issues, it particularly is true in the London Borough of Harrow, in the Edgware ward, where I started by initiating a series of questions to the council to say how many registered houses in multiple occupation did they have on their books. I was astonished when they told me they'd got 89 for the borough, when I could say, well, I can take you to roads in Edgware where there are 89 in the road. And quite clearly, the problem is one of the resources the local authority has, to be fair, to actually deal with these issues, but also, more importantly, the fact that people just do ignore their responsibilities. And I think this is one of the aspects that I think has to be dealt with. So I come on now to the report itself, and I will not deal with the recommendations that the government has taken on board, because I think that's fine. We all agree with those, and I'm delighted that they are taking them on. But I do worry about some of these aspects that the government is not so far doing, and I wonder if, therefore, the Minister, when she replies, can update us, because, after all, the government response was some nearly 5 months ago since the government gave the response to the report, and things, hopefully, have moved on. So I will go through the report just with the ones, I think, which I would like the Honourable Member, the Minister, to answer. First, on the housing, health and safety rating system. In the response from the government, there is a view that this is partly accepted, but that the government will review this position in due course. So I wonder if the Minister can update us on where that review has reached, because the reality is, as the Chair of the Select Committee mentioned, on carbon monoxide poisoning, on other measures which are safety measures in homes, and the Honourable Lady, who's no longer in her place, raised the issue of a desperate position in her constituency. The issue here is one of ensuring that tenants' safety is paramount. Over the period of time, having served on this select committee, we've had various different aspects of safety. And my concern is that building regulations and safety regulations do not seem to be being updated in the way they should be to protect both tenants and also point out to landlords their responsibilities. So if we can understand the position where the government has reached in that particular area. Equally, the issue was one of where the government is reviewing with the Law Commission what legislation could be enacted. Clearly there, the government say that they're having discussions with the Law Commission. Well, that's always helpful. But could we be updated with the results of that discussion? Because I think clearly, as I've said, if we introduce legislation, we've got to be careful that we don't put off good landlords from renting out their properties and maintaining good order, but at the same time, squeezing out these criminal behaviours that are quite clearly unacceptable. So I turn now to the Section 21 notice issue, and we will, of course, have a debate in this place, I think, next Thursday on the subject, and I don't want to rehearse the discussions that we're going to have there. Because no doubt the Minister will be answering that if that debate proceeds as expected.
My Thursdays are your Thursdays.
Well, that's welcome. But can I take up this issue? Because one of the issues here where we made recommendations, obviously the government has not accepted this, but agrees to keep it under review. I think we have a delicate balance to strike here, because the sad reality is that if landlords are in a position whereby they cannot evict bad tenants, then there is a serious problem, because then landlords will say it's not worth being a landlord and letting out the properties. Section 21 notices, and being the author, promoter, sponsor of the Homelessness Reduction Act on Section 21 notices, I know in infinite detail, obviously are due to be no-fault evictions. I mean, quite clearly, we need to preserve the position whereby the landlord can get their property back, but equally, at the same time, we seem to be being in the position whereby on the current position of 6-month tenancies, some landlords routinely just issue Section 21 notices as protection for their position of wanting to get their property back at the end. Clearly, one of the solutions here is to have longer tenancies protected in the way so that there's protection for the tenant and protection for the landlord, with the potential for break clauses on both sides. Now, that seems to have gone very quiet in government thinking at the moment, and I hope that my honourable friend can actually update us on where we're going in terms of longer tenancies and protection of tenancies. The other issue that I'll just mention is there seems to be a suggestion from the government that retaliatory eviction is a relatively rare occurrence. Well, for those people that gave evidence to us who have suffered retaliatory eviction, it may be a rare occurrence, but it is a life-changing experience and one that we must condemn. The sad fact is that landlords have a duty to actually keep their homes up to a reasonable standard and a safe standard, and if tenants complain about the fact that the property is not kept up to standard, it's quite right. It's quite right. The landlord then puts it right. But if the result of that is the landlord then evicts the person or the tenants, that is an outrage. And I think we need to ensure that action is taken. And at the moment, I think there's not enough protection for the tenants from that position. Equally, we had, and I think the chair of the Select Committee mentioned, the Specialist Housing Court that I think would be warmly welcomed by both landlords and by tenants. And if we can have an update on what the status of the review is by government, I think that would be terribly helpful and informative to the committee. Two last things before I sit down, Mr. Rosendale. First is this issue of we made a recommendation on the local housing allowance, particularly on studio accommodation. Now, in London, this is becoming a big issue, where properties are being subdivided into small units and then put out for rent, and the tenants are therefore being exploited. I think there is a case, as we have made within the report, for taking action on this particular area, and I would welcome the Minister taking some action on this particular area. I accept completely that it's not necessarily true across the country, but in London, this is a really serious issue that I think has to be addressed. The final issue is that of the penalties for bad landlords and the protection of tenants. I don't normally read The Guardian, but they've provided a very helpful they've provided a very helpful brief on their coverage of rogue landlords and what has happened. So the sad reality is that if landlords fail the fit and proper person tests to be landlords and they're banned, then all their tenants should know about it. I mean, that just makes sense. And so to have a position whereby a landlord can be banned in one borough but carry on renting in others just does not make sense at all. So I think one of the things that we need to see is urgent action to introduce a position whereby landlords are banned and therefore action taken. And I agree that in the most serious of cases, just a fine becomes part of doing the business. So actually having the ability to confiscate the property and to protect the tenants from the behaviours of rogue or criminal landlords has to be the final issue. So, Mr. Rosser, I'll sit down on that particular point, and I look forward to the Minister's response and working together with other colleagues on improving the position both for tenants and also for the good landlords in this country.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosendale, and it's a pleasure to join my former colleagues on the Local Government Select Committee for their excellent report. And I genuinely do say that I miss their committee, and if you understand that I've been moved on to Procedure Committee rather than Local Government, you will understand quite how much I miss you as well. And the reports that we did together on the committee were very, very useful and very thought-provoking, and the contributions by the honourable members here today are indicative of the attitude that they take to their work in the committee. And the report is an excellent piece of work which highlights many of the issues within the private rented sector in England. And I suppose they must miss me from the committee somewhat themselves, because I noticed within the report, when I was on the committee, I would try and make comparisons to Scotland, where we've done a huge amount of work on the private rented sector in recent years. And there are some good points of comparison that perhaps if I was on the committee still I might have added to that report, but I would hope to highlight some of these issues here as well, because I know that the Minister has come to visit Glasgow before and spoken to some of the professionals within Scotland too, so she will understand that there are things that we've done in Scotland that may be of use in England also. And I want to start, I suppose, by mentioning the Private Housing Tenancies Scotland Act 2016, which came into force on the 1st of December 2017, and is coming up for its first birthday. And it made a number of changes within Scotland. So it moved so that we had open-ended tenancies, so that rents were more predictable and there was protection against excessive rent rises. There was an ability for local government to introduce local rent caps for rent-pressured areas, which is really important when you see some areas where rents are spiralling out of control. And we had a comprehensive and robust grounds for repossession as well for landlords, but they had to be done in 18 specified circumstances as well. So it wasn't just because the landlord felt that they wanted to take the property back, but they had to meet those tests as well. So that gives protections both to tenants and to the landlord. And disputes between tenants and landlord can also be heard in a new specialist tribunal that we brought into place to handle those disputes, which is a useful thing, I think, for everybody all round. And we also made it so that all letting agents have to register and adhere to a code of practice, which goes some way to what the Honourable Member for Hertford and Stortford mentioned around professional qualifications and skills. If there's a code of practice in place, at least, then that gives something to the professionalism of those companies. And I very much agree with what he said around qualifications, because are an awful lot of people, I think, that end up being landlords in the private rented sector who didn't quite start out that way. So maybe they bought a flat as a younger adult, they moved on, they kept the flat on and tried to use that as a rental income. And they don't quite understand what their obligations and responsibilities are. And it became, for a while, a way of making quick money as well, to buy flats and rent them out. So I think there needs to be a bit more done to make sure that landlords understand what all their obligations are as well. Absolutely.
I agree with the Honourable Lady about codes of practice, and I'm keen to support them, but I've come to the conclusion that actually we need to be clear that you cannot operate in this market unless you have the qualifications. It'd be rare for me to necessarily say that, but I think, does she accept that that mandating side is actually stronger than necessarily a code of practice?
Yeah, and I would be interested in seeing how that proposal develops, because I think it would be useful, certainly. And I think it would give some reassurance to tenants as well to know that their landlord had some kind of qualification to put a roof over their head, and it might get rid of some of the more criminal elements in there as well. Because what we have also in Scotland is that all landlords have to be registered. All of them. There's not the kind of the hodgepodge of local registration that was mentioned in the report. And that means that if people do step out of line, those landlords can then be banned. So in my own constituency, we have had problems, some problems slightly like the Honourable Member for Harrow East mentioned about tenants being exploited and lots of people being crammed into one flat. And particularly in Govan Hill in my area, it's an area of very high private rented sector owners and lots of rogue criminal, as the Honourable Member for Sheffield East suggested. Rogue sounds a bit more casual, but criminal certainly is the better word, I feel. And in May 2018, 5 landlords were struck off the landlord register for renting substandard properties. In September 2017, a further 9 were struck off the landlord register and banned as well. And this is all publicised and this all goes in the press, so you know who that landlord is. There is no doubt as to who they are and what they've been up to and the kind of conditions that they've been living in. And because we've had the Govan Hill Enhanced Enforcement Area as well, this gives council officials the power of the right of entry to properties as well. So if there's any suspicion that the properties are not up to standard, council officials can enter those properties. And when they first did this, only 21 of the properties that they met the Scottish repairing standard on their first inspection. When they came back for a subsequent inspection, 175 properties met the standard. So there had been a clear improvement through that process as well. So having local authorities have given the power to enter flats and do those assessments is quite important in making sure that standards are met. And it also gets around some of the issues around political will and some local authorities not wanting to do things. If everybody has to be registered across the board, that at least is a first step, and then prosecutions can then follow from that if required. But I don't think it's been enforced long enough in Scotland to be able to tell, really, I suppose, how widespread or whether there are postcode lotteries, because housing varies quite substantially from my constituency to other parts of Scotland as well. And I would draw the House's attention to the Nationwide Foundation's report about vulnerability among low-income households in the private rented sector in England, because it makes for very interesting reading. And they mention as well that the proportion of privately rented properties failing to meet the Decent Home Standard has been falling, and the number of such properties has actually increased. So its number and proportion are quite different here. But they highlighted as well, as other honourable members have mentioned, that most properties failing were in a Category 1 hazard, a sort of severe or immediate risk, which should frighten us all, actually, if people are in such terrible conditions that it could risk their life and being. And I would urge the government to do a bit more to make sure that those properties do meet those standards. And I would very much urge the government as well to do more on this issue of revenge evictions. And again, from our legislation in Scotland, that's something we've managed to mitigate against, something we managed to act on. But Generation Rent also produced a very interesting briefing on this, where they mentioned that in 2017, 12,711 evictions by bailiffs happened under the Section 21 accelerated process. But this is likely to be the tip of the iceberg, because not an awful lot of those people might go through the court process. We wouldn't know necessarily how many people have actually been evicted. And they point out also that 2/3 of private renters have no savings. So if you've got no savings and you've just been evicted, the last thing you're going to want to do is go and try and force that through a court process. You just don't have the means to do it. You'll try and find somewhere else as quickly as you can and move on. So we need to get a better understanding of how many people are facing evictions through this process too. And I think that moving to a sort of national database and moving to better data gathering on this, I think would be very useful in informing what happens next. And I think that the government ought to perhaps think again a little bit, and I'd be interested in seeing what the Minister has to say on the things that the government didn't quite accept in the review, but the committee would like to continue to push on, because I think those are good suggestions, they're solid suggestions, and particularly with this revenge eviction issue, I think we need to really protect people, because it is a growing sector. There are more and more people who are more and more vulnerable, families, and it's not just kind of young people renting a flat for a while. This is people living their whole life in the private rented sector now, because there is a severe shortage of housing in some parts of England, and I think we need to be looking at those people and how we can better protect them, because it's clear with the points that the member for Sheffield East and another have made about the kind of legislation on legislation and that cumulative effect, that the protections are not where they should be, and people need to have that so that they can have some certainty in their lives, because not to have that certainty has huge impacts on people's health and well-being and their prospects, and particularly for children if they have to move quite a lot as well. We need to make sure that people are protected as best we can. And lastly, I just would like to agree very much with the point that the Honourable Member from Hertford and Stotford made about lettings such as Airbnb, and I think that the Minister would do well, I think, to consider that further, because I think this could be a kind of emerging gap in the market. We need to make sure that this is protected somehow within regulation also. Thank you very much, Mr Rosendale.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Rosendale. This is an important debate, and we've had some really helpful contributions, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield South East, for securing it and his leadership in the Select Committee, along with other members of the committee who are here today, and I think have raised, all of them, some important points. I should be clear at the outset that, as you would expect, we would agree with the committee's assessment that the majority of landlords are good landlords. I don't think anybody's questioning that. They play an important role in the housing system and in our society. But as the committee's report illustrates, the situation faced by a growing number of private renters is intolerable. I think most of us here today see in our constituency surgeries, I certainly do, the horrible things that too many people have to endure. The 800,000 privately rented homes with at least one category 1 hazard, landlords cutting off electricity to vulnerable tenants, letting agents demanding hundreds of pounds to do things like view a property. Mr Rossendale, I think what we need is to keep in mind all the time what these private renters want. That needs to be the test for policymakers, and I think there are two things. First, they want to rent a property fit to be called a home, and second, they want the same rights and redresses enjoyed by consumers in lots of other areas of society. For many, the private rented sector undoubtedly fails these two tests. Standards at the bottom end of the market are poor. And as we have said on this side many times, you have more rights buying a fridge freezer today than you do renting a property. This report identifies some important failings in government policy which have led us to this point, and I just want to look at two broad areas. One, the lack of intervention and enforcement, and the other, the imbalance of power between tenants and landlords. So on lack of intervention and enforcement, as the report demonstrates, outdated legislation and the lack of intervention means the current system to set and enforce standards doesn't work. We agree that the current legislation is overcomplicated and built up over many years and become somewhat hard to navigate and dated. Penalties are not strong enough to deter bad practice, and fines are too small to incentivise legal action in the first place. We've already heard about the importance of the Homes Fit for Human Habitation bill being brought by my honourable friend, the member for Westminster North. But the government could have helped this become law years ago if they'd accepted Labour's amendment to the Housing and Planning Bill in 2016. The fact that so little enforcement action is being taken is all the proof we should need that the system is broken. As we've heard, the Advice for Renters campaign group has estimated that just 0.1% of landlords letting non-decent homes are prosecuted each year. The Guardian today has revealed that 9 out of 10 local authorities failed to issue a single civil penalty notice against a landlord or letting agent last year. It's impossible to deny that the billions in cuts faced by local authorities have affected their ability to enforce through environmental, health and trading standards. And I do accept the argument that we need leadership in local authorities as well, but the extent of the cuts have been very significant and must inhibit what local authorities are able to do. And the fines being so low mean there's even neither a deterrent for bad landlords nor an incentive for councils to take action. We share the disappointment that's been expressed by the LGA and others that the government ignored the committee's recommendations to improve enforcement through increased fines and powers. And the report was right to raise concerns about the situation with landlord licensing schemes. I've seen the positive impact in my own borough of Croydon, where Croydon Council have issued over 30,000 licences. And it's wrong, I think, for the Secretary of State to hold a veto over councils wanting to tackle rogue landlords. The Secretary of State has blocked councils like Redbridge from introducing borough-wide licensing, and there's a clear contradiction. Ministers talking about standing up for renters, but their actions proving otherwise. So to turn to the imbalance in the private rented sector, I think the report is clear at the things that need to be done to make the rules fit for purpose and to make them enforce more. But I think there's difficult, deeper societal issues, structural issues within the private rented sector. The committee rightly points out that we can't draw a clear line and say there's a small minority of rogue landlords and everyone else is perfect. This oversimplifies the issue and ignores the structural problems, which mean that a landlord doesn't have to be rogue or even breaking the law in any way to make tenants' lives difficult. There's an imbalance that no court or enforcement authority can solve because it's part of a system which is fundamentally skewed against private renters. And this system is stacked most heavily against those at the very bottom, that is clear. Permitted development and abuse of the local housing allowance in lockdown properties make a mockery of planning and welfare rules. This is a symptom of a broken housing market, where we're failing so badly to build the homes we need that the government is essentially saying anything will do. Tenants left with little or no choice pay the price. But yet again, the government ignores the committee's valid recommendations on this topic. We could talk more about what needs to be done in terms of landlords refusing to rent people on benefits. This is an issue that comes up repeatedly in my constituency, and I know Shelter are trying to take some legal cases through court to try and affect that, but I won't talk more about that now, but that really is heart-wrenching in surgeries. Retaliatory evictions are a real concern, as has already been talked about and rightly raised in the committee, when 44% of renters say they won't negotiate over disrepair for fear of eviction, and when charities are having to warn people that raising a complaint might get them evicted, that is a structural failure of the system. We agree that the current protections are nowhere near robust enough to avoid retaliatory evictions or punitive rent rises. I've seen this happen to my own constituents, as we all have. We would go further than the committee's suggestion of extending the time limit for protecting tenants from Section 21, which the government seems to be not doing anyway. If we're saying that Section 21 is unfair for those who've made a complaint, then why are we accepting it for those who haven't complained? No-fault evictions are at the heart of the imbalance between tenants and landlords, and they should be scrapped entirely. The government has admitted it needs to do more. It says it wants to rebalance the relationship in the rented sector and give tenants access to redress. But the record towards renters, people would be right perhaps to be sceptical. Consultations, calls for evidence or plans to introduce measures like a housing court, ombudsman schemes or letting agent regulation are worth very little if they don't result in action. And the department has a bad record, frankly, of turning consultations into legislation. 185 housing consultations have been launched by this department since 2010, 185. Too often that fails to translate into anything substantial. The government recently announced plans to look at introducing 3-year minimum tenancies, which then appeared to be quietly dropped. There's also little point in a housing court or ombudsman if tenants don't have rights to protect in the first place. The department's record on private renting so far has been to talk tough but to under-deliver. The government has blocked Labour's proposals to amend the tenant fees bill so that deposits could be capped at 3 weeks. And this would mean, as already we have talked about, an average saving of £575 for tenants across England or £928 in London. The current 6-week cap actually has the potential to cost tenants more, because we know that the majority, over 50% of landlords charge 4 weeks' rent as standard. So that would actually end up increasing people's deposits and not saving them money. The recent... Yes, of course.
I'm grateful to Honourable Lady. She's setting out her party's views on a number of issues. A number of people who are good landlords are very anxious about future rents. Is it the Labour Party policy in government to cap them or index them?
We would, as I was just coming on to, we would have 3-year tenancies, and you would not be able to increase the rents above inflation over that period. So it's not a matter of setting what the rent would be, but it's a matter of having more security in your tenancy, and then more ability to understand the level at which that increase would happen over that longer period of time. Yes.
So there could be no tenancy shorter than 3 years, I take it from that?
Well, so it's interesting you should say that, because we are looking at what developing our policies in this area, because we've also said we want to scrap Section 21. So we need to look at how that would work and what those conditions would be. I think what's really important to stress, though, is what we're not saying is that people should have a right to indefinitely remain in their home if, for example, they're not paying their rent, or they are, you know, in other ways causing disruption or antisocial behaviour. That's absolutely not the point of what we want to try and do. There will always be a need for a landlord to be able to evict tenants who are not paying their rent, or who, or for whatever reason, should not be in that property. And I think what we need to find is that middle ground, where at the moment, particularly in London, and perhaps what I see in Croydon, when you talk to some of the renters, organisations like Generation Rent, what they talk of is a cycle where people are being evicted for no obvious reason, often when, for example, a landlord might not be an expert landlord, as we've talked about, somebody who's inherited a property or has moved out of London and has got a property and doesn't really know what they're doing, and they might decide to move back in, or they might decide to do something else with the property. And you have a group of people who are constantly having to move because they're being moved on through Section 21 evictions, or you have people who can't afford the rent increases, and so they also are having to leave through Section 21. And it seems an imbalance of power is our starting point when we're looking at policy development. Hope that answers the honourable gentleman's question. Yes.
So, is my friend basically said the proposal will be very similar to one that I think Shelter put before the committee in 2013-14, which was for 3-year tenancies, with the rent in that period linked to some inflation measure. So there was a clear understanding by both landlord and tenant what it would progress through the course of the tenancy. But the other issue we raised, I think, and it comes back to the housing court idea, that if that happens, then landlords do need a way reasonably quickly to get a tenant out who is not paying their rent. Yeah. And having a housing court might be one way to enable that process to happen, to make landlords more comfortable with longer-term tenancies.
Yeah. Thank you. I didn't see Shelter's evidence in 2013, but yes, that sounds a reasonable way forward. And the absolute starting point, which I said at the start of my contribution, is that we know that most landlords are good landlords, and we are not trying to create a system where they can't function and they can't evict people when they need to. What we're trying to create is a system which is fair. And we were fortunate to go to Berlin recently to see, as many people have, the system of renting that they have there, and to look at some of the other models. And I think there are lots of lessons to be learnt from other countries. I should make some progress. the Guardian and ITV investigation into the private rented sector, which has been talked about already and has forced a U-turn from the Prime Minister, is worrying. Despite government estimating there are 10,000 rogue landlords, not a single name at the point of that investigation had been added to the database. That was in October, which was more than 6 months after its launch. One wonders what the point of a rogue landlord database is if you haven't identified the rogue landlords. The Mayor of London's database has over 1,000 entries, and I would hope that the government and the Minister could give us an update on where that database has got to today. Also, the government announced that they would give £2 million to local authorities to take action against bad landlords, but that does amount to £6,000 per council. Meanwhile, trading standards teams expected to enforce new legislation like the Tenants Fees Bill have seen enforcement officer numbers down by 56% since 2009. These teams have faced funding cuts of almost £100 million since 2010, and local authorities overall have had billions from their budgets taken away. So 6,000 doesn't feel like enough in that context. So we would recognise the scale of the challenge and think that a more radical response is needed, a consumer rights revolution. We have a commitment to end unfair evictions, and I'm proud that my local council in Croydon was the first to pass a motion calling on government to scrap Section 21. We've committed to give renters, as we've just been talking about, greater security with a 3-year cap on rent rises. We want to name and shame rogue landlords and introduce tougher fines for those who fail to meet minimum standards, with those fines funding local authority enforcement work. We would properly support landlord licensing and set a 3-year cap on rent rises. We also want to see greater powers for mayors across the country to control rents, if appropriate, in high-cost areas like London, which we haven't talked about earlier. Inspired by the system in Germany, we have committed to spend millions to kickstart renters' unions, and we spent time at the Labour Party conference talking about that with the London Renters Union, who've helped many renters out of situations where they've struggled on their own. So we want root and branch reform of the private rented sector. It's too dysfunctional to tinker round the edges. Mr. Rossendale, the end result of insecure tenancies, of unsafe homes or extortionate rents is staring us all in the face. The end of a private tenancy is the leading cause of homelessness today. 1.6 million people who are in chronic debt, 120,000 children who will wake up tomorrow without a home, and that's not to mention the million people under the age of 35 who are an extra million who are unable to buy their own home and are forced to rent in the private rented sector. I think for all of their sakes, we should reform the private rented sector. Thank you.
Heather Wheeler.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Rossendale. And I thank honourable members present for across the House for their considered speeches. And I congratulate particularly the honourable member, my friend from Sheffield South East, for securing this debate. So before I move on to the substance of the debate, I'd want to again thank the honourable member for Sheffield South East and all the members of the Housing Communities Local Government Committee for their inquiry into the private rented sector, for working with the government to improve the lives of those living in the private rented sector. The private rented sector plays a vital role in providing homes across the country as an integral element of the government's approach to making the housing market work for everyone. As we outlined in our response to the committee's inquiry, over the past decade, the private rented sector has changed dramatically. Not only has it grown to become the second largest tenure, but also houses an increasingly diverse range of tenants. It is a great credit to those who deliver and support the private rented sector that the sector has managed to react to such change and continue to drive forward improvements in quality, standards and safety. So I want to use this speech particularly to reflect on the committee's report, outline some of the work the government is delivering to ensure that everyone living in the private sector is able to build on the life that they desire. We agree the vast majority with the committee's recommendations, and even where differences arise, these are of differences of degree, not of kind. While I cannot cover everything in such a short time, I hope the members present will see how the government is pursuing a package of measures which will work together to improve the private rented sector. As the committee cautioned in its report, the government recognises it cannot take a piecemeal approach to the private renting sector and must instead take a holistic approach to reform. Successive governments have all shared the opinion that the rights and responsibilities that govern the private rented sector must be placed on a statutory footing. In its report, the committee raised concerns that the volume of legislation that covers the private rented sector could be creating a complex and challenging landscape to navigate, especially as we've heard again today. While the government shares the committee's desire for greater understanding, we do not at this point feel the legislation is in need of a type of root and branch reform that the committee suggests, or indeed the Labour front bench. Instead, we believe the challenge for government is to help everyone understand the legislative foundations of the sector to ensure that people can best make use of these important protections. That is why we are structuring our work to address the key challenges that flow from overarching objective to rebalance the relationship between landlords and tenants, to deliver a high quality, fairer and more affordable private rented sector. In order to achieve this aim, we need to address a number of interconnected challenges with the committee, which the committee also highlighted in their report, namely affordability, property standards, enforcement, rights and responsibility of landlords, agents and of tenants. So I want to use this debate to set out some of the work underway to drive improvements in the sector, how this work links together and the progress that has been made since we responded to the committee's inquiry. On affordability, a lack of affordable rented property can mean tenants are forced to accept substandard or unsafe accommodation. This is not a choice we want anyone to face, and this is why we're working so hard to improve the private rented sector and to ensure that it is a choice that no tenant faces in the future. We believe that the key to improving choice and affordability for tenants is actually to build more homes for rent. So to answer my honourable friend's question from Hertford and Stortford, we want to build more homes. We want build to rent to continue to grow and make a significant contribution to the housing supply. That is why the government introduced the £1 billion Build to Rent Fund and the £3.5 billion Private Rented Sector Guarantee Scheme to support thousands of extra homes being built specifically for private rent. But we also recognise that house building takes time, and that is why we are working to improve affordability and conditions for tenants right now. On the Tenants Fees Bill, we introduced the Tenants Fees Bill to protect tenants by capping tenancy deposits, banning unfair fees at the outset, and renewal and termination of a tenancy. As well as helping tenants, the bill will strengthen the hand of good landlords and agents across the UK by levelling the playing field, driving out rogue operators and ensuring that reputable landlords are no longer able to undercut those who overcharge. Yes, of course.
Had it been brought to my attention by Christopher Mullen-Silverstein, who works in our Whip's office, that there are quite common disputes around leaving a tenancy. So, to give an example, he had to pay for cleaners before he was allowed to leave. The landlord then disputed the fact that the cleaners had been in and done a good job and is withholding the deposit as well. So he's having to pay for additional cleaners plus the deposit plus an exit fee. So these fees mount up and make it more and more difficult for people to actually move on to other tenancies with all this debt that they accumulate.
Yes, indeed. Those stories are legion, and that is why we brought the bill in. And finishing a tenancy is very important. It really should be done incredibly carefully on both sides, so that that matter does not arise. And I'm sure that the honourable, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. Right. As is testament to members from across the House, this bill has been well received and supported throughout its parliamentary journey. I'd also like to thank the honourable member for Sheffield South East and the other members of the Housing Communities Local Government Committee for their detailed pre-legislative scrutiny, which served to strengthen the bill. So whilst improving affordability runs throughout our work, I know the committee shares our commitment to improving property standards and safety. So on the Homes for Fitness and Human Habitation Bill, obviously I must thank the honourable member for Westminster North for all her work in developing and progressing the bill. This is again an excellent example of cross-party working, which is going to lead to meaningful progress and strengthening the private sector, rented sector in the future. Under the provisions of the bill, landlords will have to ensure that any dwelling that they set out is free of hazards from which risk of harm and a rise to health or safety of the tenant or another occupier of the property. And where a landlord fails to meet that requirement, those tenants will have the right to take action in the courts. This bill would give the courts the power to order non-compliant landlords to take action to reduce or remove hazards, and tenants will be able to seek compensation when landlords refuse. I'm going to move on because time is really running out and there are so many questions that you guys wanted me to answer. So I'm going to do my very best. And if I don't manage to answer you today, I'm sure we'll be able to write to you later. So the Housing, Health and Safety Rating Scheme, and I can never say this, the HHSRS, God, I hate that phrase, never mind. So the government is explicit in its belief that one person in an unsafe home is one too many. We understand the scale of the challenge and taking steps to ensure central government sets out the appropriate standards and local authorities have the tools they need to enforce these standards. This has been around since 2004, and we are, everybody has said it's very complicated, so we are recommending a review of the HHSRS, and so it is the right time to look at that, and so we will need to see what we need to actually put into practice to see how it needs to be updated. That fits very nicely with the Homes for Fitness for Human Habitation Bill, which hopefully will be finishing its time and turn into an act very shortly. We are also acting to improve safety and have announced, in line with the committee's recommendations, the introduction of the mandatory 5-yearly checks on the electrical installations in private rented sector. We will introduce this, bringing forward legislation for mandatory checks as soon as parliamentary time allows, and we will also be giving the government response to the consultation before Christmas on that. The HHSRS, we expect the outcomes of the scoping review in next spring. And I know, I've got it that time, didn't I? But the second stage will follow after that, and that will also be set out in the scoping review. And on the carbon monoxide matters, we're expecting the outcome of that review shortly, and then we expect to consult on the proposed changes. An announcement on the next steps will also be made shortly. On lockdown properties, it's absolutely unacceptable that a minority of rogue landlords exploit the housing system by converting their properties into tiny self-contained units, which are unsuitable, so that they can get a higher rate of housing benefit or indeed rent, and of course try and avoid the HMO licensing requirements. MHCLG and DWP are analysing the evidence of the relationship between housing benefit, housing tenure and quality, and we're committed to working together to understand how we can make best use of our financial levers and existing powers to support tenants and improve the quality of housing while entering value for money. On the housing court, as a lot of people have talked about today, we support this. We are very interested in taking this forward. Both landlords and tenants have raised concerns about this, and effective and efficient access to courts is vital for both landlords and tenants who wish to challenge bad practice. When all other options have been exhausted, landlords should be able to recover their properties when they have reason to do so. And tenants should live in the knowledge that the court system should protect and support them where needed and will not leave them lost in a sea of legal confusion. We hope the committee welcomes our recently launched call for evidence, which will gather views on user experience of the courts and how it could be improved. And building on the committee's recommendations, our proposals explore whether a specialist housing court would make it easier for all users to resolve disputes, reduce delays and secure justice for both landlords and tenants in housing cases. This work not only speaks to the court experience, but cuts across the committee's concerns regarding retaliatory eviction and is a key consideration in our work on longer tenancies. So on longer tenancies, just to be absolutely specific, the call for evidence on the housing court was launched on the 13th of November and closes on the 22nd of January. So work in progress, ladies and gentlemen. The call for evidence also designed to help us understand the correct use and experience of the courts, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing the evidence that's put before us when the call of evidence closes. On retaliatory eviction and Section 21, Our position is clear. No tenant with a genuine complaint about the condition of their property should be fearful of retaliatory eviction. That is why we've already taken steps on this matter, legislating to protect tenants from retaliatory evidence through the Deregulation Act, but we're also aware that the vast majority of landlords provide well-maintained properties, and thankfully only a small number of tenants encounter the threat of retaliatory eviction. As set out in a recent letter to the Honourable Member for Sheffield South East, despite the rarity of the practice, our commitment to protecting tenants against retaliatory evidence is undimmed. What a great word. Well done for writing that one. Right, we share the committee's position that the government must ensure tenants are properly protected from retaliatory eviction. That's why we've included consideration of retaliatory eviction in our consultation on the barriers to longer tenancies, to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information to inform our thinking. The consultation on the longer tenancies closed at the end of August, so not that long ago, and stakeholder events held in September. We're analysing the responses and will respond shortly. We did have a very large number of responses, over 8,000, so it is important to consider those fully and align with the workload of our experience in the courts too. On longer tenancies, considering the volume of responses is no small feat. We're working to provide the government consultation in due course. So I will move on from that. Here we go. So, local authority capacity and enforcement. Quite a key point of this afternoon's debate, and I do appreciate I've got to do 2 minutes for my good friend from Sheffield to close. I know personally from my experience in local government the vital role that local authorities play in the private rented sector, but particularly in respect of enforcement. The committee called on the government to support local authorities to make best use of powers available to them and to go further. And this is what we are going to do. Not only have we designed our enforcement tools to allow local authorities to retain the financial penalties raised to drive back into their teams to fund future enforcement activity, exactly as Torbay has done. Torbay have been extremely successful in enforcement work and receiving fines. Indeed, they've employed another officer on the back of the fines, and they've already managed to receive. Clearly, the committee members will also be pleased to hear we've launched this £2 million fund to support local authorities with their enforcement work, help them. This will upfront boost will allow local authorities to grow and refine their approach. This funding came as a direct response to my department engaging with local authorities from across the country in roadshow events throughout the summer. And so in response, we're creating a compendium of enforcement guidance which will bring all relevant guidance into one place, along with templates, and will form part of a national training offer to local authorities at all. So equipped with effective powers and armed with guidance and support, local authorities will become ever more effective in targeting their work to remove bad landlords and protect tenants. I think I'm running out of time, Mr. Rosendale. So what I'd really like to do is just to thank everybody for a really excellent debate this afternoon. It's great that the way parliamentary time works, in effect it's been 6 months since the work, and other stuff has been able to actually come to fruition in those 6 months. So I hope that my remarks today demonstrate the government's commitment to building a private rented sector that works for everyone, one that supports good landlords to deliver the homes the nations need, which provides safe and secure and affordable homes to tenants. We do not shy away from the challenges facing us, and we are aware that we need to support the entire private rented sector if we're going to achieve these goals, indeed taking on Airbnb if necessary. And it is in that spirit that I thank the honourable members for their speeches and questions today, and I look forward, Mr Rosendale, to working with the honourable member for Sheffield South East and the other members of the HCLG committee in the next weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.
Mr Clive Betts to wind up.
Rossendale, I think, as though everyone would agree, it's been an excellent debate on the report, and I think the report's generally been welcome. Can I just, a correction at this point to say I should have referred to the fact that I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association, so that should be on the formal record. As well as thanking members who've contributed today to the debate, particularly thank members of the Select Committee. As Honourable Member Harrow said, we produced our report, as usual, with a unanimous recommendation, having considered the evidence before us. And that's how we try and work. It is true to say, Mr Rossendale, that the majority of landlords do a good job, offer good premises to tenants who are satisfied with their home. So our report focused on the bad landlords who really do need tougher action taking against them. We welcome many of the steps the government have taken, but want to push them further. We also recognise there's an issue of resources for local authorities, and I think as a committee we'll come back and look at that again in the new year, the whole issue of local government funding, and of course the available properties. And the honourable member for Hertford and Stortford said that he was pushed the idea as Minister of Build to Rent. That's absolutely right. We also need more social housing as well. There's also an issue of political will at local authority level about enforcement, and we referred to that, and we're looking forward to the LGA's response with the government about benchmarking. The Minister answered many of the points we raised, and it was really a pleasure to have her back in her place. I think we all very much welcome her today. She's answered many of the points. There are some that, in the time available, I've noted we haven't had an absolute response back to, and we'll be writing to her next week about that. But I thank the government, and we will be continuing to monitor government's progress on the very important recommendations we made and the government's actual action on them, not just the words, but the action we want to see in due course.
The question is that this House has considered the fourth report of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee Private Rented Sector, HC 440, and the government response, HC 9639. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.